Alright guys, BLM here, back with a new video, and in this video we're back with another 10-year anniversary video for an Assassin's Creed game, which will actually be a year where I do two of these back to back, where there were two entries released in 2014, yet here we're going to be starting it off with Assassin's Creed Rogue, commonly talked about as the darkest Assassin's Creed game, which is a largely comical take to me, where for me this is really a game that I remember as the most generic Assassin's Creed experience, really feeling extremely shallow despite having a really interesting premise. Obviously with the game's concept being that you're following around the Templar perspective, except that it doesn't do that and just feels like a generic Assassin's Creed story, just so happens to just swap the names of the factions, with the assassins acting like Templars and the Templars acting like assassins, while the gameplay again just feels very derivative of recent Assassin's Creed games, though obviously there's reasons for that, but it ends up just being a largely lackluster entry in the series, with this feeling like a game made at the last second just to make money off those that didn't upgrade to the next gen consoles at the time, but that seemingly being the only purpose of this game, to where to me it doesn't really end up adding much to the series as a whole, and actually ends up causing a lot of issues for the consistency in the Assassin's Creed lore. And again, I do know there are people that love Assassin's Creed Rogue that think it's the most underrated entry in the series, yet that's simply opinion that, after having replayed this game numerous times, is one that I just simply cannot get on board with. With that, again, we'll be running through this retrospective similarly to my previous ones, where we'll do a full rundown of the overall campaign later in the video, though first I want to talk about some more general aspects of the game, starting it off here by talking about its development cycle, while also bleeding into talking about its gameplay innovations, where, as I mentioned previously, again, there were two Assassin's Creed games released in the year of 2014, with this coming out the exact same day as Assassin's Creed Unity, again, only being released on PS3 and Xbox 360 at the time, immediately after the launches of the PS4 and Xbox One, which obviously is where Assassin's Creed Unity came out on. To where, as a whole, I do get this business decision of wanting to have an entry to still sell games to a portion of the audience that might not get the next-gen consoles, though obviously this also feels like the peak of Ubisoft's oversaturation of the brand, and again, having a yearly cycle still at this point, but then now getting to the point where we're having two main entries on literally the same day is just an insane thing that Assassin's Creed did here. But this was also the peak of my love of the franchise at this point. I mean, this is a point where I was obsessed with Assassin's Creed. I remember just in between classes, I'll be reading random articles on the Assassin's Creed wiki, to where again, I remember being extremely hyped for Assassin's Creed Rogue and Unity. Actually, at the time, being more excited for Rogue itself, as again, someone that didn't really have the funds to buy a PS4 and Xbox One at the time, and I knew I was going to be able to play Rogue. And with Rogue also having these connections to previous entries, and being branded as the end to the Kenway saga, again, I was very excited for Rogue, where again, I remember when we got the original leaks, it being called AC Comet, where you'll be playing as a Templar. It takes place in between Black Flag and AC3, with it being meant to bridge the gap between the two, and having a whole bunch of appearances from characters from those games. Again, it just felt like this massive piece of fan service, which at the time, I really just ate up. But I do think as time goes on and me starting to think about things more critically, all these connections to the rest of the series end up just coming off as a massive mess. But I remember at the time, I looked at Rogue as one of my favorite entries in the series. I remember there's a point where I loved it more than AC4, which is an extremely comical take now, but again, I did love Rogue at the time. As time goes on, you really just recognize how it just simply isn't that good, with it just being humorous how half-baked the overall writing of the game is. But again, the game was released in 2014, developed by Ubisoft Sofia, where it was entirely developed over the course of a singular year, and you can very much tell through playing the Man campaign, which is relatively short, and just the general gameplay of this game is obviously very similar to the likes of AC's 3 and 4. Very clearly reusing a bevy of assets from those games, which leads to very little innovation in this game, and through that you can very much tell how much that limited how much they could really do narratively, essentially forcing them to utilize an assassin turned Templar, and keeping with the basic AC gameplay, as they wouldn't have had enough time to radically shake up the gameplay to accommodate for this being a Templar based game, where again, Shay just plays like an assassin. But again, I think that is at least somewhat excusable considering the time constraints. What I don't think is excusable is what they do with the narrative of this game, to where again, there's so many questionable writing decisions and outright laughable lines through this game, to where again, this game's development cycle is not that different from the likes of AC Brotherhood or AC Revelations, with Revelations in particular again being one of the greatest stories ever told in the Assassin's Creed series, to where again, this does not excuse the very sloppy writing that this game game has. So again, considering the massive quality differences between these games' narratives, it does leave the very messy writing of Rogue as, again, just simply inexcusable. So while I do think, again, having an assassin turned Templar does not shake up the experience as a whole, it still actually does provide for what could have been a pretty perfect Assassin's Creed story, where narratively Assassin's Creed's story is supposed to be this examination of the Assassin's Creed, as in the title, and showing how that creed changes a person's life. And while we've seen it change people for the positive from Altair and Edward, in this premise here could have been the opposite, which could have been very interesting. Again, showing how the creed turned someone away, and really could have delved into the fallacies of the creed and show a lot of complexity through that, except just that it doesn't, and it instead shows the Assassin-Templar conflict in a very shallow way, which in essence really takes away from this really strong initial premise. I do want to talk about the general gameplay here before we run through more specifics about the narrative, where obviously a lot of the gameplay here ends up just being a redo of AC4, with obviously many of the same systems and same exact parkour system with no real improvements there. The base combat is also the same, which again, as a whole, is a pretty passable combat system, though relatively easy. Stealth functions pretty similarly in this game as well, which again is both good and bad. Though obviously here we get the addition of the air rifle, which essentially just acts as a blowpipe from AC4 with sleep and poison darts, but can also shoot firecracker distractions as well. That doesn't really add that much depth there. Though later in the game, you also get a grenade launcher, which shoots berserk and sleep grenades, which function similarly as the former, which expands the range on them to potentially hit more than one target, which is pretty useful. Though you also get shrapnel grenades, which can open up pathways and damage multiple enemies at once, which again can also be helpful there. There's also the inclusion of environmental hazards, with Shay having the ability to pull up a gas mask over his face, with the assassins utilizing a lot of poison gas in this game for whatever reason. And also with Shay now being a constant target to the assassins, it adds this interesting dynamic to this game of there being stalkers, potentially always hiding in hiding spots, so they'll attack you, to where as they near you, you see the screen glow red and whispers start playing. And along with that, you also get a compass added to Eagle Vision, similarly to the AC multiplayers, that helps you find these stalkers. And along with that, there's also bounty hunters that can be sent after Shay, similar to pirate hunters and Black Flag, which all this is, again, are really nice additions, playing into this notion of you being this Templar as being hunted by the assassins, which if only they did that effectively in the narrative as well. And along with that, another nice little touch added to this game is the reintroduction of the ability to kill civilians in the Animus, something that was entirely taken out after AC3, though along with this, they also keep the notion of you getting desynchronized for killing too many civilians during Shay's time as assassin, which is taken out when he's a Templar. Again, a really nice little touch here, where obviously the entire point of all this is that killing civilians goes against the Assassin's Creed. So through that, that's fundamentally desynchronizing you from your ancestor, which is why that occurs in the OG games. While here, again, once he's not an assassin, he's not playing by that philosophy, to where, while again, it's still very weird to think that Shay would kill random pedestrians, it is not a fundamental core pillar of his character. Again, I think overall ends up being this nice little touch there. But obviously with, again, this game taking a lot from Black Flag, we also get a lot of focus on the naval systems of this game, where while Black Flag was obviously a lot focused around this pirate fantasy, this game instead takes place during the 7 Years' War, which I don't think is really a setting that many people were clamoring for. But the naval combat does perfectly fit with this setting, where supposedly there was just as much naval activity during this time period to that of the golden age of piracy, to where, again, it at least feels natural there. Now, obviously, with that, you do get a different ship than in AC4, which is a smaller ship than the Jackdaw. For the level design of the River Valley in particular is essentially a bevy of tight canals, where obviously having a smaller ship allows for you to navigate through those more cleanly. Also, this, we have the introduction of the Icebreaker Ram, which allows you to break through glaciers in the North Atlantic. There's some collectibles in there. Also, during combat, you get the introduction of Burning Oil, which takes place of the fire barrels, which I found to be a lot more effective, covering a larger range. Although we also get the introduction of the Puckle Gun instead of the Swivel Gun, which also is a lot more effective, both in naval combat, but also when boarding, where it makes it a lot easier to kill enemies from a distance, which makes the monotony of boarding a lot more tolerable here. Also, an interesting addition here is that enemies can now board you, which actually ends up making things easier, as you still go through the exact same boarding process when that happens, to where it actually takes away a step of you having to capacitate the other ship, to where that's another change I did personally like. Though this game does obviously still require you to upgrade your ship at points, definitely less so than in Black Flag, though obviously in turn the game is just a lot shorter, to the point where I did not find the grinding in this game nearly as tedious, where just through naturally getting cargo through the main campaign and completing just like a couple warehouses, you can very easily get enough supplies to pretty smoothly finish the game. And with that, cargo ends up mostly being the same as AC4, with metal and wood and cloth all being main components to upgrade your ship. All tobacco is now the cargo that you get to sell for money, all while we get the addition of stone, which ends up being more useful in renovations in New York. And with that, let's now talk about the open world, where there are 3 different maps in this game. We got New York, River Valley, and the North Atlantic, with each being vastly different from each other. Now, New York is the main city of the game, which obviously was previously utilized in AC3, definitely reutilizing assets in that vein, though this version of New York ends up being a lot bigger, but also looks a lot less dull, clearly utilizing a different color palette from AC3, but also taking place before the Great Fire of 1776, which allows for New York to feel like this big, thriving city. So again, it just has a radically different tone to that of AC3. So again, I like this version of New York definitely better than AC3, but not to a radical degree. It's just a city that doesn't really stand out. It's not necessarily bad, but it really just does not hold a candle to some of the best cities in the franchise. Though, as previously mentioned, we do see the return of the renovation system with this game, where you can utilize stone and money to renovate buildings. It gives you increased revenue over time, but they're also being gang headquarters that function similarly to Borgia Towers, to where doing them obviously allows you to renovate buildings in that area. Where again, this game essentially gives you the ability to renovate the entire city, like in AC Brotherhood and Revelations, which is cool to see. But again, feels like this mechanic that was simply just brought back to add more content to the game that would have been relatively simple to add to the game. And that really, that kind of sums up Rogue. Where again, as I mentioned, Rogue is essentially the greatest hits of Assassin's Creed in the sense that it reuses a lot of aspects of previous Assassin's Creed games, with almost nothing in this game actually coming off as entirely unique to Rogue. But also, we've got 2 other locations in this game, and those 2 end up functioning similarly to the Caribbean from AC4, and that you navigate the entire map in the Morgan, with there being numerous locations that you can stop on by, varying from settlements to outposts to forts to warehouses. Now, the River Valley feels very reminiscent to the Frontier from AC3, clearly reutilizing a lot of those assets. But again, it has these tight canals to navigate through, where in general I do find this area actually pretty annoying to navigate through because of how it's designed. It has a lot of you just going around things. All the North Atlantic ends up being a bit more unique of a map, entirely comprising of Arctic icy locations that felt really unique to the AC series, making this area in particular stand out amongst the franchise, feeling like the most notable section of the game for me, though in itself does have unique quirks like icebergs that you can crash into to get frozen cargo and animus fragments. All while I've always liked the detail that if you stay in the water for too long in this area, you end up losing health, where again, those are nice little touches added to this section. But with that, now let's talk about the side content, which again plays very similarly to AC4, where each location has a checklist for you to cross off, with this game having so many collectibles, taking collectibles to the extreme, with it again feeling like compensation for its really short campaign, where obviously all these collectibles are necessary for the 100%. And again, many of them are also just reused from previous entries, which kind of just sums up the game as a whole. Here we do have animus fragments, which when getting all of them, it unlocks a message from Juno that doesn't matter. You have treasure chests, which inside you can also find some blueprints that allow you to get highest level upgrades for the Morgan, which is necessary to take down the legendary ships, which make their return here as well. Shanties return, though instead of pirate songs, they're replaced with Irish songs to play into Shay's heritage, which again makes sense, though these songs don't stick out to me as much as AC4's. You got Templar maps, which essentially lead to buried treasure, where getting all of them gives you a Templar armor that looks kind of ridiculous. Oh, well, we also have Viking sword fragments, where finding all of them unlock a new location where you get Viking armor, which also looks ridiculous. And with it, there's also native pillars, which feel like the steles from AC4, which give you a short puzzle of aligning these pieces to form a continuous path. So getting all those give you the native armor, which looks a bit better, but still not great. Really, all these special armors in this game don't look the greatest and give you very marginal benefits. But there are new collectibles here, like prosperity fragments, which boost the rate that you get money and resources in the game, which obviously helps with renovations and crafting upgrades. But again, it's kind of funny that these exist where this is essentially a collectible to help you with other collectibles. But either way, we also have the cave paintings, which are kind of lame of them unlocking a story about the legend of the Sky Woman, which obviously tells a story that's meant to correlate to the Isu, but it really has almost no relevance here. We also have war letters, which are actually kind of cool in them, containing messages typically by or for characters from around the AC universe, with many references to the other games in the Kenway Saga, along with Liberation and Unity, where again, there's some cool lore bits here, though like most of Rogue, not all of them make much sense. But as for the actual side missions, which there aren't that many of, I mean, you have hunting challenges with hunting playing a similar role in this game to AC4, where you can hunt animals to craft upgrades for Shay, though again, these end up being pretty tedious missions, having to kill specific animals, specific amount of time. That again just feels like busy work with not much substance here. Also, we get assassin interceptions in place of the typical assassination contracts, which again, I think actually is a cool mission type here that really plays on the concept of being a Templar, where you have to intercept the contract by catching a carrier pigeon and then find and defend the intended target from the assassin's gang, which again is an interesting flip on the typical formula, though the missions themselves are just kind of dumb, as there's no real incentive in finding all the targets before they attack their target, as when time runs out, the game will just tell you where they are and you can kill them easier that way. But also, I do want to talk about the modern day, which is also more of the same from AC4, to where while the context is different, still has you going around the same Abstergo entertainment building, which again just feels really funny in how they literally just copy and pasted the section from AC4, but somehow make it even worse, where AC4's is bad in itself, but somehow they make this one even more pointless. So again, there's still a lot of Easter eggs to be found here, to where in place of notes from the last game, the collectibles around the office here end up being tablets, which contain messages from Mel and Leela May, with many of them talking about previous AC characters, which is pointless fan service. Oh, we also still get the hacking mini games that unlock documents and audio files, where the mini games themselves end up just being the same laser style puzzle over and over again. And all the files here end up relating to Otto Berg, who ends up being a major focus slash just a character that's there in the modern day, as we'll talk about. Though I remember at the time being so excited to see Otto Berg finally getting his time to shine in a main campaign, after him being a pretty prominent character in side media before this, and him feeling like a really interesting character conceptually, though obviously by the end his role in this game is just kind of funny. We end up finding a lot of audio files here. We have Otto Berg's profile, a series of audio files detailing major times in Berg's life, many moments that have already been mentioned in previous material, but us now getting to listen in on them, I guess. Again, seeing him being recruited by Vivek, and the lead up to him capturing William Miles, and his experiences using the Animus, though we also get Sigma Team's Most Wanted, a series of audio files having Berg talk about the major modern assassin figures, where these don't really matter, but I remember I loved this at the time, hearing him talk about the likes of William Miles and Gavin Banks and Harlan Cunningham. Though realistically, not much new info here. We also get Berg's Inspirations, a series of videos of Berg talking about the former assassin traitors, which is just pointless fan service. Also, we get probably the most important, even though none of these are really important, series of collectibles here in the Phoenix Project. Where in these, they end up talking about the current operations of Abstergo, talking about the hunt for the Koh-i-Noor and the Ankh and the modern assassins, which again, really cool lore bits at the time, where again, it felt like there were these big mysteries being set with the Ankh and the Koh-i-Noor, only for that to lead to nothing. Anyway, with that, I think we're finally ready to talk about the narrative of the game, where again, this game was built up as the closing chapter in the Kenway Saga, strangely taking place in the middle of two previous entries, set again in the 7 Years' War, which straight up I just find to be a rather boring setting, feeling very reminiscent to the American Revolution, which in itself I also found very boring. But obviously this one was just less big historical events, to where I did not find this setting particularly interesting, though at least it's one where, again, you can kind of tell that they picked it simply for the sake of the narrative more so than actually being the most interesting setting, which again kind of takes it back to something like Revelations and how it's approached there. Also again, clearly picked as a middle ground here, allowing them to reuse assets, but also characters and plot threads from previous games, only for them to butcher those, as again, we do see the appearance of previous characters. We get Adewale from AC4, we get Achilles and Hatham from AC3. We're all cool to see back here, but I feel like these characters are really mishandled on their return here, with none of them really having that much depth. Definitely less depth than they had in their first appearances. Really, at the end of the day, they all just come off as fan service here, which again just feels like the bulk of the reason why this game exists to begin with. But the main campaign does have us playing as an assassin turned Templar and Shay Patrick Cormac, where again, having an assassin become disillusioned with the creed and turning to the Templars and believing in the Templar ideals is a great potential Assassin's Creed story, but again, I do feel like the story here is pretty much told in the most shallow way possible, and while there are decent setups at points to Shay's conflict with the assassins and Achilles early on in the game, once he defects to the Templars, no depth is really given to that decision, with the Templars now acting essentially as if they're assassins, being portrayed as these generic good guys, while Shay never really shows actual care for the Templar philosophy, and just sides with them because they're against the assassins, which is an underwhelming way to tell a story, with this solid of a premise, where despite this game being meant to show you a different perspective of the Assassin-Templar conflict, it ends up really not doing that, and just showing the same perspective with which faction is which being completely flipped. Now, as a whole, I do actually kind of like Shay as a character. While not amongst the best in the series, I do think there's a certain charm to him being this man strong in his ideals, to where he's willing to turn away from everything he had once known to fit into his moral code. And at points, I do find him to be a somewhat humorous character, though some of that is due to his overacting and some really funny lines that they give him, and making him a much more memorable character to me, and one that I've always personally connected with, even though really the writing of his character is still mostly shallow. I mean, he does largely just come off as an idiot through most of this campaign. Where again, his flip to the Templars doesn't even fit within his overall ideals, to where he ends up being upset at the assassins for trying to dictate how people live their lives, when that's the entire basis of the philosophy of the Templars. Where again, Shay just comes off as kind of an idiot throughout most of this run, which can be kind of frustrating. But also, Shay ends up being really just a massive walking retcon as well. One that was clearly not in mind when AC3 was in development, despite how integral he is to the events that lead up to that game. Also being a massive retcon to Unity as well, which is something that, again, we'll later talk about, where obviously having Shay not play a factor into either of these games does come off as largely ridiculous from a storytelling perspective. While also, again, just the events of Rogue do very much contradict events previously established in AC3, where, again, in AC3 they had very much detailed the fall of the assassins and when exactly it took place, to where, again, this doesn't line up with that, which, again, is a thing that you wouldn't notice as a casual fan of the series. Though the reality is that Rogue really mishandles its continuity, particularly through a lot of very minor details, where, again, it's minor enough to where you're not really going to notice it unless you really know the lore of the franchise, or again, you can largely overlook these flaws, even though how dumb certain aspects of the story do come off once you know these. But with that, again, let's start actually running through the campaign, starting it off with Sequence 1, which ends up being a solid start to the game, where despite the fact that the majority of it is just tutorials and the basic setup to the plot, much of which doesn't feel very unique from previous entries, it still does solid work in setting up Shay's overall arc, even though, again, it's followed up in a pretty unsatisfying way. But the game does start with an opening monologue from Shay, filled with exposition, but he is Shay Patrick Cormac, and this is his story, being this very cheesy opening line. But again, we do get a great opening mission here that does feel very reminiscent to the first mission of AC4, though it does do very effective work in showcasing the parkour system right off the bat, with you thinking that Shay is already a Templar, and you're about to kill an assassin, only for it to be revealed that that wasn't really Shay's target, and that Shay is an assassin at this point, actually being a new recruit to the Colonial Brotherhood, which does make the amount of important field work that they make him do beyond this kind of ridiculous. But the person he assassinated is actually his best friend Liam O'Brien, a fellow, more experienced assassin, which essentially ends up being Achilles' right-hand man, a dynamic that does play into why Shay is not fully buying into the assassins, and him clearly feeling lower on the pecking order. But Liam does come off as his mentor figure here through his run as assassin, to where they do have this playful banter at the beginning here, to where Shay says, "I nearly had you," while Liam chalks it up to luck, with Shay saying his infamous, iconic line of, "I make my own luck, Liam," which is a line that I always found super funny, and it's something that always lingers in my head, of this really over-the-top line that Shay proceeds to say over and over and over again. But really, Liam, like the remainder of the new assassin characters in this game, end up coming off as very shallow, very underdeveloped, to where, while he does get some pretty decent dialogue at points, particularly in his discussions with Shay, I still feel like I come out of this game knowing nothing about Liam outside of his dedication to the assassins. This is followed up with us meeting another of the fellow assassins, Chevrolet, which you could not pay me to actually try to bother to pronounce his entire name, though he ends up being a more openly antagonistic figure to Shay here, with him just coming off as a massive dick for no reason, constantly calling him cabbage farmer, saying that no training will make you a proper assassin, and goes on this spiel about how we are going to ensure freedom for the human race. leading to, again, another funny line from Shay to me of him saying, "I don't feel too free at the moment," all leading to them getting to a fist fight, aka a tutorial to melee combat, though again, as a whole, not a very good first impression for the assassins here. But after working together to rescue some smugglers from British soldiers, they end up commandeering a ship, the ship that ends up being the Morgan, Shay's ship for the rest of the game, which is pretty convenient. But this ends up giving us a pretty expected tutorial on naval combat, defending Chevrolet's ship, leading up to a pretty lackluster title card at the end of the camera zooming out while they set sail to meet the assassin mentor, which is a moment that doesn't feel nearly as impactful as many of the previous title cards. And in general, I guess I might as well talk about the music of the game here as well, where the music utilized here is one that just feels very reminiscent to previous games, where in general, the soundtrack of this game is also essentially a greatest hits, previous entries, where there's a decent amount of songs that are essentially just reused tracks from AC4, and even those that aren't have a very similar sound to it. It's also the first game to utilize Ezio's Family as a reoccurring track, where from this point on, there ends up being a new version of Ezio's Family made for every entry of the series beyond this, which is bad. As much as I do love Ezio's Family, and to be fair, Rogue's version of Ezio's Family is probably my personal favorite version out there. It is one where I do think the utilization of Ezio's Family now as essentially the Assassin's Creed theme is something that really takes away from the point of Ezio's Family, which is a song to really resonate Ezio to his family, utilized in a very effective way in AC2, to where beyond this, it's simply just a song they use because it's the most popular song from the series. To where I know people argue that, oh, Ezio's Family is the assassins, that's what his family is, when it's like, that's not what the original point of the song was, though. And it feels unnecessary that that's a song they used here, and it being used in every entry beyond this really saps all of the meaning behind the song. But with that, we then transition to the modern day for the first time, being awakened at Abstergo Entertainment by Violet da Costa, a new character added for this game that, along with her introduction, gives us some very blatant exposition, revealing that we're doing a very similar style of modern day to AC4, thus playing as another Abstergo employee, which is supposed to be the player, which is also a different character from the one in AC4, which is so stupid. But again, Violet's another character here that does come off very shallow, or her main character trait here is just calling the main character Numbskull, as we somehow stumbled across a virus through exploring Shay's memories, where it causes the entire building to shut down and evacuate. Though it's in this moment where we see Otto Berg tell Melanie May has now become the new CCO to continue researching into Shay's memories, because he has a very important thing he wants to do with them, which I'm sure will be very important. But this leads to a short sequence of us getting our first hacking minigame to get the Animus back in line, but right away this setup does not really bring much intrigue here, with all this coming off as very superfluous, which I would say that this could be a similar issue to what happened in Revelations, where obviously in Revelations they couldn't progress the modern day story because they already had the direct continuation of the modern day story already set out for AC3. But the issue here is that the AC3 in this situation is essentially Unity, which has no modern day. Or you could say it's Syndicate, which started development at the same time as Rogue, to where, again, there's really no excuse for how pointless of a modern day Rogue ends up having here. Anyway, we go back into the Animus for the rest of Sequence 1, where we get the arrival at the Davenport homestead, obviously being a reused location from AC3, but obviously years earlier than that, to where right away we end up seeing a younger Achilles from AC3, which is funnily voiced by the same guy, who is obviously just fundamentally older than what he was when he played him in AC3, yet is able to actually play him as a younger version of himself. But also here we see a older Adewale from AC4, to where in a little cool detail, you can actually listen in on their conversation, or if you do so, you learn about an earthquake in Haiti, which I wonder if what happened in Haiti will happen in Portugal. But beyond that, we get more tutorials with Shay being trained by his fellow assassins, meeting Hope Jensen and Kasegawase, where they're clearly being set up to be future targets for Shay down the road, but neither of them really have much depth to them either, with Kasegawase just being outright boring, with him not really bringing much to the game as a whole, all while Hope is a character that seemingly just had potential, with her and Shay having a bit more of an interesting dynamic to them, with it being implied that Shay has romantic feelings for her, and there could have been this conflict that stems from that and Shay's layered betrayal, but again, it just ends up being completely wasted, to where she ends up being another underdeveloped character. But really, this entire section does show the assassins being pretty arrogant here, with Achilles running a similar ship to that of Al-Malim in AC1, essentially just showing the Colonial Brotherhood to be terrible here, hypocritical, and going against the basic tenets of their creed, which is, again, is fine for a game meant to critique the assassins, but again, I feel like it's done here in a way that just feels too heavy-handed. It feels like very shallow, with this notion not even being something that's actually directly mentioned within the game itself. But to be honest, we do get tasked by Achilles to hunt down 2 artifacts the Templars stole in a manuscript and a precursor box, but first we need to get a tutorial on the naval upgrade system, which again just felt like a redo of the AC4, version of this, but eventually we do meet Le Chasseur, a spy for the assassins that seems to be added here just to add another target for Shay to take out down the road. Here he is told about a Templar named Lawrence Washington who has the manuscript, leading to Shay being tasked with assassinating him. Again, for some reason, bringing up the question of why is Shay, this newcomer, being tasked with these seemingly important missions here to when you have the more experienced assassins like Liam and Hope right there. But anyway, it leads to a naval tailing mission, because obviously people love that, to take some cargo that we think is the manuscript, only for it to be the air rifle. Yay. But it ends up being pretty helpful in this upcoming section, which needs to be done undetected, as we do find Washington at a party, with him clearly being ill and being surrounded by Jack Weeks, who is a character in this game, but also Wardrop and Smith, who shockingly end up being Shay's next two targets. Also, here we get the appearance of George Washington, because we need a fan servicey cameo here. But this ends up being actually a solid assassination mission here, with there being plenty of opportunities for social stealth, feeling reminiscent to the banker assassination from Brotherhood, though it's also one where you can literally just shoot him from afar, and that kind of nullifies all that. But we do get some interesting final words for Washington here, with him revealing that this is all a distraction for the others to escape. The first of many times this will happen in this game. But clearly Washington's already on his deathbed here, to where after escaping, we do see Shay's first doubts in the assassins over this being a pointless assassination, with them not getting much from it, seeming to shake his faith in the leadership of the group at this point, in the overall concept of assassinations. But despite that, he continues to do them after he leaves the assassins. But anyway, it takes us to sequence 2. One of the longer sequences in the game, one that really just showcases the rest of Shay's disillusionment with the assassins, starting off with 2 assassination missions, taking out Smith and Wardrop, and in turn obtaining the box and the manuscript, with Smith's involving some naval combat, before eventually killing him on land, which was mundane, all while Wardrop's mission takes us to Albany, where we assassinate him within a fort, to which you see Wardrop testing Shay's ideals, talking about how everything is permitted and no one is safe. Though even here we do see Shay still defending the assassins in this instance. But through this mission we do also get a cameo from William Johnson and Ben Franklin, with William Johnson clearly having a different voice actor from AC3 and really ends up being kind of irrelevant after this. But we do learn about Franklin being used by the Templars to research into the box and manuscript, taking us to the following mission, which focuses around us having to work with Franklin to find out what the box and manuscript do, which requires us to take back Franklin's lightning rods after the army confiscates them, which is a pointless mission and a really monotonous tailing mission there. But finally, we do end up realizing what the precursor box does, which is translate the manuscript, while also revealing a map to precursor sites. Yet the only one that we, for some reason, decide to point out is Lisbon, which is convenient based on historical accuracy. But all this is, again, a very contrived solution to what the box does here, where, if you do not know, this precursor box made its first appearance in Assassin's Creed Embers, where Ezio ends up giving Xiao Jun a similar box as they part, to where the assumption coming into this game is that this was the same box. And if that was the case, the fact that Ezio gave her a box that he told her would help her if she loses her way would be utilized to show her precursor sites would be just, again, very dumb in that light. But they decide to then further convolute it in revealing after this game came out that there's actually multiple boxes that have different abilities, to which they later reveal what her box does in the AC Chronicles games, which is also equally dumb, which all this clearly goes against what Darby McDevitt initially intended when writing Embers, and turning this into another example of how Ubisoft does not know what they're doing with the franchise. But with this, Shay is then tasked to go to Portugal alone to receive the Piece of Eden, which, why, other than allowing for this misunderstanding that ends up occurring that allows for Shay to turn on the assassins, as this seems very convenient that for this specific mission that's supposed to be this very important mission that you're sending Shay without any guidance over these other more experienced assassins. But here we do find the precursor site, which just so happens to be beneath the church, leading to a monotonous section having to climb to the top of the church and find 4 holes to poke through to unlock the entrance, which seems dumb that that's how you access this vault, with, again, that seeming very easily accessible, and considering how dangerous this temple ends up being, and all this just comes off kind of dumb. But again, we obviously enter the temple and see an artifact in the middle, which Shay picks up, only for it to disintegrate in his hands and the temple to start shaking, causing an earthquake, revealing that these temples aren't sites to hold pieces of Eden, but instead are meant to keep the world stable for some reason. Really, this ends up coming off as so contrived once again as a plot device, where it feels like something intentionally just made here to make Shay hate the assassins. These sites, to my knowledge, never appearing ever again in the Assassin's Creed series, at least the main campaigns, where just the concept of them here just seems really dumb. As why do these exist? And why are these sites so easily accessible to where it's so easy to just cause wide destruction just accidentally? Also, how did the assassins not realize what they were doing here? As, again, supposedly the same thing happened in Haiti, which caused the earthquake there, where you would think that they would realize the timing of it would be very convenient to where this might have caused that. But again, all this just comes off as very lazy writing to me, being this very flimsy explanation of why Shay turns on the assassins, though it does lead to one of the more notable sections in this game. And obviously this causes this earthquake, meaning that Shay now has to escape, leading to this massive set piece of us having to parkour through the crumbling streets of Lisbon, feeling very reminiscent to the parkour you would typically see from an Assassin Tomb, just with a worse parkour system. But clearly the game wants you to be feeling something through this, thinking of the horror that is being brought to the city, though I do very much struggle to care, where, again, we spend no time in the actual city itself, to where the only gameplay we get from it before destruction occurs within a church, to where I do think this could have been a lot more impactful if we got some gameplay heading to the church, maybe meeting some locals, having some sort of attachment to this city outside just the general notion that a lot of people must have died. But anyway, the mission ends with Shay looking at the wreckage, with us seeing Shay's devastation as the guy next to him says, "How could God do this to them?" only for him to say, "God had nothing to do with this." With, again, him clearly feeling guilt for having destroyed the city, but also clearly just being upset at the assassins for leading him to do it, which that seems to be his main takeaway from all this. He really just ends up putting all the blame on the assassins for this event, taking no responsibility for himself, and seeming to think that he was tricked into doing so, and that they wanted this to happen all along, and thinking that they're planning on utilizing these sites to cause destruction, which makes no sense. Which, to be fair, I guess can be correlated to how little Achilles seemed to communicate with Shay, to where we do see Shay's annoyance at Achilles not really telling him things and being secretive of things to him, to where, again, the fact that Shay doesn't actually have a full understanding of what the assassins do, and the fact that, again, they're meant to protect precursor sites, not actually utilize them, is something that, again, Shay maybe didn't know because of how poorly Achilles handled this, though, again, that's not really made clear if that's the reason why he's thinking this way. To where instead, this entire defection from the assassins just comes off as very contrived to me. To where it takes us to the final mission of Sequence 2, having Shay return to the homestead, with him barging into Achilles' room, saying, "So what is the next city you want me to spite? And what happened in Haiti happened in Portugal. Thousands dead thanks to your damn manuscript, saying that you made me slaughter innocents." And again, all this is just so funny to me. Really just a series of some of my favorite lines from this game that just come off as so over the top. But it's clear at this point that Shay seems to think that just all precursor devices end up doing this much damage, which is dumb considering you would think that he would know about the other pieces of Eden by this point, where obviously all of them don't do this, though Shay is completely irrational here. Though, again, obviously Achilles doesn't handle this well either, just kicking him out, leading to Shay breaking back in and stealing the manuscript, with Achilles catching him, leading to this back and forth between the two, with Achilles calling him out for betraying the Brotherhood, and that the future of the world is tied to that manuscript, which, I mean, you probably would have been better off just destroying the manuscript, but Shay does say that you don't have the right to decide the future. Which, again, funny that he says this as he turns to the Templars, who do fully believe in that. But again, in this instance, Achilles says that we have the responsibility, which, again, just feels like a really dumb misunderstanding here, and that Achilles seemingly means that they have the responsibility to protect the precursor sites, yet the way he says it is in a way that clearly comes off as him saying that they have the responsibility to decide on other people's future, which, again, in essence goes against the actual creed of the assassins. To where, again, just comes off ridiculous that the entire plot of this game essentially just stems from a misunderstanding, which, again, I do think is a shame, as I do think there could have been some great character work in this game. Again, character study on Achilles, who is a very questionable leader, having a questionable state of mind, and him having just lost his entire family and has clearly mishandled the assassins, which all of which could have been this great criticism of the assassin's philosophy, and have Shay leave the assassins due to him recognizing the fallacies in the assassin's ideals, but instead leaves because of a basic misunderstanding, which again is dumb. But this does lead to another set piece as we have the escape from the homestead with numerous assassins and soldiers, I guess, hunting them down, with mortars being shot at him as well. But it all culminates in reaching a cliffside where we get this really over-dramatic sequence here of Shay being held up at gunpoint by Liam, where Shay decides that after all those souls lost, one more hardly matters, and proceeds to jump, only to be shot in the shoulder instead. because I guess that was necessary. To which we do see Shay fall and hit his head, to which, game over, right? Thank God this game has put it out of its misery. Only for us to get back to the modern day where Violet is shocked that there's more data, which is also actually really dumb, as obviously he survived, as how would they even have Shay's DNA to comb through to begin with if he died in this instance? As again, you need genetic memories, meaning that you can only see the memories of a person that had a child and only see the events before that child is born, where again, obviously Shay is still alive at this point. But anyway, this ends up transporting us to an incomplete memory, taking us to a mysterious location that we later piece together is Paris, conveniently the location of AC Unity, which came out on the same day, where we play as an older Shay, conveniently at the same time period of the beginning of AC Unity. I wonder if this is going to be a tie-in, which, what a tie-in it is! Here we do learn that Shay is searching for Benjamin Franklin, leading to us having to chase down and kill 3 criminals before they get to Franklin, only for the scene to end with Franklin still being in danger, which made this pointless. But anyway, we do get back to Abstergo, where we do officially meet Otto Berg, calling Shay the most important assassin to ever live, I guess. But again, this doesn't really progress the modern day at all. So we get to sequence 3, where Shay awakens in New York, where the majority of the sequence takes place, giving us tutorials that obviously come with the additions that New York provides, all showing Shay's defection to the Templars, thus meeting a new set of allies, where the story somehow gets even more shallow. But we do end up catching up with Shay here a few months later, still recovering from his injuries, with him under the care of the Finnegans, who obviously come off very friendly and caring of Shay, though it does go unexplained on how he got there initially, as a way to make the Templars look even better down the road. Though, to add to that, the Finnegans' house proceeds to get attacked by a local gang that happens to be run by the Assassins, which is so stupid. So again, this completely goes against the basic ideals of the Assassins, who are meant to fight for the oppressed, not be the one oppressing the people, which again, had this been used to show how far gone the Assassins are from their initial ideals, it would have allowed this to be somewhat rectified, but no, it's just giving Shay some enemies to kill and showing the Assassins as the bad guys. But anyway, the Finnegans give Shay their son's armor, implying their association with a certain group, before we proceed to chase down another gang member, which, to be fair, I've always liked as a mission type to introduce us to a new city. All this really just leads to a tutorial to gang headquarters, where you notice that the gangs are parading around an assassin logo on their banners, which is also so stupid. Again, the opposite of hiding in plain sight. What is following is that we do meet Colonel George Monroe, who is a character that really sums up the issues with AC Rogue, being a Templar here, but being one that ends up being Shay's mentor and one that ends up convincing him to join the Templars. The issues that he's portrayed in the most shallow way possible, being this goody two-shoes who proceeds to introduce the renovation system to once again make him look like a good guy, and in general him saying he takes a different approach from his counterparts because he cares, and he doesn't govern, he merely assists. And talks about how he fights for freedom from want, as that is the greatest freedom of them all. Words that would be typically said by an assassin. Now, to be fair, the final statement can technically be interpreted as a description of order, which is obviously what the Templars seek, but still, utilizing the word freedom in that feels very assassin-y here, to where Monroe just really comes off as a character that is essentially Templar in name only, not really seeming to hold any of the true ideals of the Templars, but just is one, obviously to convince Shay that the Templars are the good guys to side with here, despite the fact that Shay never really buys into the Templar beliefs until he just randomly does at a point. So again, he seemingly only sides with the Templars because of Monroe's guidance, and because they're simply working against the Assassins, who are still actually fundamentally more in line with his actual philosophies than the Templars are. So again, it really just takes out the complexity of the Assassin-Templar conflict here, and in favor just shows their dynamic in a very one-note way. It really just shows us as, oh, the Templars are the good guys because they're just against the Assassins, being essentially just the opposite portrayal of the other more shallow entries in the series. But anyway, Monroe does task Shay with rescuing a comrade of his, Christopher Giss, who is about to be executed, and we have to save him within a time limit. So we have to shoot down rope in time while there are a number of enemies around you. Through this, we do end up meeting Giss, who later becomes our first mate, and also ends up being a Templar. But what do you know? He ends up being another really shallow character in this game, having no real depth to him, and largely becoming a very unnotable character outside of the fact that he has this very over-the-top ridiculous voice. But this does lead to us conveniently noticing that this gang also has a nearby anchored ship, which ends up being the Morrigan, conveniently, giving us our next gameplay bit of us having to clear a dock of assassins to reclaim the ship, which acts as a tutorial to stalkers in this game, though I do like this section, how it does really feel still open, allowing you to kill these enemies in any way that you want, though the game does give you firecrackers here, which allow you to lure stalkers out of their hiding places. But again, this very much does feel in line with the fantasy of being this assassin hunter that this game was marketed as. But following this, we get back to the naval gameplay, giving us tutorials on warehouses and forts, to where when reaching the war room, we find Le Chasseur, to where we get a boss battle with him that really incentivizes you to counter on nearby objects to do more damage, despite the fact that you can literally just strike him a few times and assassinate him, which makes this entire fight a joke. But obviously this ends up being the first of Shay's former associates that he assassinates, but who cares, because it's Le Chasseur. And we do finally see him warn Shay in his final words that he's been supporting poison gas for the assassins in New York, which is like, are you telling him this? But again, it does take us back to New York, where we end the sequence with a mission of sabotaging the gas supply, which has us tricking Ben Franklin to giving us a weapon he was making for Hope, that being the grenade launcher, with this mission obviously just being a tutorial to it, one that I found largely tedious, as the only way to destroy these gas supplies is using shrapnel grenades, which can be very slow to use, and when you're in this massive restricted area with so many enemies around you, it obviously makes this a somewhat difficult task. But again, just a very strange way to end this sequence here, where following this we do meet Jack Weeks and William Johnson, only for them to not do anything in the plot. But with that, it does take us to sequence 4, shorter sequence here that culminates Shay's indoctrination into the Templars, where after a year of working with the Templars, Monroe ends up sending a letter to Shay, revealing that he was the one who rescued him and knew of his assassin background, which again is a weird way of telling him this. But obviously again, just further showing Monroe as a good guy here. But he ends up proceeding to give Shay the manuscript back, which Shay had thought was at the bottom of the sea, only for him to then give the manuscript back to Monroe anyway for safekeeping, which won't work out too well. But the first mission here starts with us talking to Jack Weeks, who, if you can't tell, is another shallow character that's just there to set up certain missions for Shay to go on. This leads up to us rescuing Monroe from French soldiers and assassin stalkers led by Kasegawase, so I wonder who's going to be this sequence's target. But it does lead to another pretty open stealth section here, and that's having to take out 9 snipers that can be annoying if detected, as it's just so easy for you to be shot down, though. And if you do it smoothly, it is actually somewhat satisfying. But as a whole, I mean, this mission is essentially a glorified escorting mission, all while it's followed up by another weird mission that just feels like filler of us rescuing a native tribe from the assassin gang, which just feels like a copy and pasted mission from AC4, the one where you have to rescue the assassins from the invaders, and it leads up to the chief telling you about the native armor, because that was obviously relevant, and also introducing frontier clashes, which are very basic enemy encounters. But anyway, it leads up to the Kasegawase assassination mission, in which we do have to face off against him in a fort, where you can kill him using a puckle gun, which is actually the full sync here, which feels like a very underwhelming way to kill him. But something I do like here in the memory corridor sequences is that we do see them still fighting in them initially, only for Shay to overpower him, which, while it doesn't really make much sense lore-wise, I actually do like having these more action-focused memory corridor sequences here, where it really feels like adds more weight to Shay killing his former friends here by us seeing the brutality of it. But I always found this sequence here to be really funny, and just how over the top Kasegawase's acting here is, and him telling Shay that Monroe is already dead, for some reason telling him that Liam has already killed him, which just warns him of this, so why are you telling him this? But also funny that Kasegawase is essentially used as a distraction, which will not be the last time Shay will be distracted. But we get raced back to a burning building, where we find a dying Monroe, with him revealing that Liam took the manuscript. But we do get a nice passing of the torch moment of Monroe giving Shay his ring, which could have been this cool moment of Shay being Monroe's living legacy, if only anyone cared about Monroe, and if Monroe was even mentioned again after this. But again, the sequence does end with Shay returning to New York, where he is inducted into the Templars by Hatham, who again was cool to see back here. He does play a pretty big role moving forward in the game, if only he was anywhere near as interesting of a character as he was the first time around, with his writing just not nearly being as witty as it was in AC3, to where outside of a specific moment towards the end, Hatham feels like a largely watered down version of his original appearance. But with that, we get back to the modern day, where Otso ends up saying that Shay has seen the true face of the world and that he has chosen his path accordingly, and soon a similar choice will be presented to you, as if that will actually be important to anything, and in essence just spoils the ending of the game. But anyway, we get more hacking into servers, where on the CCO floor we end up having a brief talk with Melanie, who mentions Olivier Garneau and what happened to him for fan service. But this all leads up to incomplete memory number 2. It's going back to Paris to find Shay still looking for Franklin and killing more criminals, leading to a mission very similar to the assassin interceptions, which felt very lazy there. Though again, we do obviously have to have Shay, following that, tell Franklin that he makes his own luck, but proceeds to tell Franklin that he needs his help to getting his way into the Palace of Versailles to meet a business acquaintance, which I wonder who that will be. Before we find that out, we get back to the rest of the main campaign, taking us to sequence 5, a really short sequence here comprising of only 2 missions, and a really unnotable set of ones as well, outside of us working with Hatham, who again doesn't feel like Hatham, and us meeting James Cook, who's another really shallow character of over-the-top acting to make you think he's more interesting than what he actually is. But the first mission here has us getting control of Cook's man of war for some reason, giving us a naval combat encounter, which is relatively easy due to us obviously having a very overpowered ship, but it is here where we do see Adewale being part of this fight. So I wonder who our target's going to be, and what do you know, the next mission is the Adewale assassination mission, where we find him in a French fort, only for him to then run to his ship in what felt very reminiscent to the Bart Robbers assassination, to where we then proceed to get a naval battle with him, which ends up being relatively easy, only for him to then crash on shore, to where at that point the assassination comes off very similar to the Hornigold assassination from AC3, to where here we see Hatham ending up as a distraction, while we can proceed to stealthily assassinate Adewale. I've always personally had trouble doing that in this section, end up getting detected, where he ends up running from you, which actually makes this mission a lot harder, specifically because this area is surrounded by other soldiers and stalkers that do make Adewale a bit hard to kill here. Though through that, we do get some pretty interesting final words from Adewale, with him being upset at Shay for asking for forgiveness and saying that you have become a monster, Shay, which is, again, another really funny over-the-top moment there. But in reality, I mean, what we do get from Adewale in this game is fine, but I do feel like we just get very little of him, to where I very much question why he was even involved in this game to begin with again, his involvement here very much just coming off as fan service more than anything that was actually integral to the actual plot, with this also just being a very underwhelming way for Adewale to be killed off here. But with that, we get to sequence 6, the final sequence in the game, that, like Black Flag, is essentially an onslaught of assassination missions, to where we do end up taking our targets one by one, which is funny that Shay is hunting down the assassins, to where in general, again, I think that is definitely a flaw of this game, the fact that Shay is portrayed as so proactive, which is obviously a necessity for a protagonist of a story. I think when we're seeing it from the Templar perspective, in a spot where in the series up to this point, we had always seen the assassins hunting down the Templars, it again just really feels like the flipping dynamics here is not something that was really taken too seriously. But again, we started all off with a more superfluous mission here of working with Jack Weeks and robbing a British fort while dressed up as an assassin gang member to cause a distraction to stop Hope from recreating the Ben Franklin experiment to activate the box again to find more precursor sites, which makes you question why didn't they do this earlier. But again, while I do get the practicality of why the Templars would want to do something like this, as obviously it would make the following encounter easier, I do feel like this comes off as a largely unnecessary mission narratively, outside of it just being a farewell to Jack Weeks, I guess. But again, obviously the following mission is the actual Hope assassination, where we do get a moment from Hatham of him acting a bit more Hatham-like and him interrogating a soldier for Hope's location and killing him afterwards. But assassination does start with us sneaking onto her mansion grounds, having found her already done the experiment, to which we do get a pretty badass moment of her just shooting Shay down, recognizing that he's watching her. But she does proceed to fill the room with poison gas and takes our masks, to where it leads to us having to parkour our way out of the warehouse, which can be a fun assassin tomb-like section here. But as Shay escapes, Hope proceeds to poison him anyway, with a poison that slows down his heart to where he has to constantly keep moving or else he dies, which is a weird mechanic to add to this mission here. But outside of that, it ends up being a pretty typical chase sequence through the city of New York, which is a pretty nice farewell to the city, as this is the last mission that takes place within it, though can also be annoying here with her using poison gas that can stop you just as you're about to catch her. But when we do get the reveal that she was also a distraction for Chevrolet to get to the precursor site, surely the last time that someone will act as a distraction in this game. But also we do see her touching Shay's face and saying that he had so much potential as she dies, implying these romantic undertones that, again, is tough to really care about when the dynamic between Hope and Shay ends up being as underdeveloped as it is. But anyway, the following set of missions has us hunting down Chevrolet, leading to a superfluous mission of us working alongside Cook and stealing his maps. But it takes us to his assassination mission, which ends up being the final naval encounter in this game, definitely the most difficult one in the main campaign, being the only time that I feel like you actively have to go out of your way to upgrade your ship, where all the other ones had been pretty doable with just the basic supplies that the game gives you throughout the main campaign, but really the assassination itself is pretty much one for one with the Bart Roberts one, where you end up boarding his ship and end up killing him there, where in his final word, Chevalier is still a dick, and proceeds to reveal that he was another distraction, that Liam and Achilles are actually going to the real site, which again, just continuing to be this lazy writing here of giving these reasons for these assassination missions to be occurring, and him taking out his former allies one by one without having to actually resolve the main conflict too early. So again, it really ends up making Shay look like a bigger idiot that he falls for the same thing over and over again. But also, we do strangely end this scene with Shay throwing him overboard, which, I mean, I get their rivalry, but I do feel this felt very out of character for Shay, especially considering him later coming off as pretty forgiving, but really even that ends up coming off as a massive plot convenience. But we do get this funny moment at the very end of Cook asking Shay and Gis if they're part of a bigger organization, which is a moment I mostly remember more so for this ridiculous blooper that Ubisoft bothered to render they posted online, which has Shay and Gis's actors pulling a prank on Cooks, which to be honest, I would not have put it past them to actually leave that in the main game. But anyway, it takes us to the final mission, which essentially ends up being this set piece at the top of the North Atlantic map, which has us working alongside Hatham and hunting down Liam and Achilles, initially having to cross a pretty sizable restricted area filled with soldiers that is pretty easily run throughable, though it leads to parkour sections that again feel very reminiscent of the observatory in AC4, but it does lead to us finding Achilles and Liam as they find the artifact, only for Achilles to now somehow realize that he was wrong and Shay was right, which the recognition of this earlier on would have just nullified the entire game. But again, doesn't even explain why he now recognizes that he was wrong. We do see Liam attempting to shoot Shay, only for Achilles to stop him for some reason, leading to Liam accidentally knocking over the artifact, which feels very much in line with the plot conveniences of this game. This leads to another set piece of us having to chase down Liam through the crumbling cave, with us getting blocked by Sight's defenses at points, which can just come off as pretty annoying and really just breaking up the flow of the chase. But it all culminates in Shay catching Liam at a cliffside as it breaks, leading to the two falling on some ice below, with Liam somehow being mortally wounded through that. All Shay is fine, which is dumb, considering Shay literally survived the fall at the homestead where he literally hit his head on the fall, which is a much bigger fall than this one, where again, all this is really stupid. But again, I guess it's indication that he makes his own luck. And again, we do get some funny final words between the two, with Shay reaffirming that he makes his own luck, and Liam calling him out for breaking the assassins, and Shay says that he did it to save the world, which is all just so overdramatic. And again, just really funny that a character as bland as Liam here ends up essentially being the game's main antagonist. And again, I don't really feel much from the death of Liam, despite him supposedly being Shay's best friend, us supposedly supposed to care about him. Yeah, I just really don't. But following this, we do end up catching up with Hatham and Achilles immediately after Hatham overpowers him, only for Shay to stop Hatham in this instance, telling him to show mercy as he's no longer a threat. It will warn the other assassins to stop meddling with the precursor sites, which, I'll be honest, it's kind of a good excuse to keep him alive, but obviously the real reason why he's alive is because he's alive by time of AC3, where outside of that, it doesn't really make much sense to be keeping him alive in this instance. I mean, we've even seen previous games, like AC Brotherhood, really showcasing this fact. So again, it's funny that this game just shows the opposite and it working out for them, but this does lead into probably the best Hatham moment of this entire game, one that again feels back to his old self and him pretending to walk away from Achilles, only for him to proceed to shoot him in the leg and threatening him. Obviously explaining why Achilles is crippled by the time of AC3, but also being a pretty badass moment for Hatham here that feels very much in line with the intimidation tactics he would use in AC3. But again, the overall timeline of all this occurring makes no real sense in conjunction to AC3, where these events actually occur 3 years earlier than the events that were detailed in AC3, meaning that either, again, it's a major oversight, which is very likely, or that this is written in intentionally, meaning that they planned on the assassins losing twice, with Achilles being spared in both situations, which seems really dumb. But anyway, this all culminates in a final scene between Hatham and Shay, where Hatham ends up tasking Shay to find a precursor box, saying that it could take him a lifetime, aka an excuse of why he doesn't show up during the events of AC3, while also explaining his later connection to Unity, something that feels fundamentally dumb. To where, again, like, why would this stop him from going back and helping out his allies in the Americas, knowing that they're in trouble? But also, he finds the box well before the ending of the events of AC3. Like, by the time he finds the box, Hatham is actually still alive, to where, again, all this just feels like another very flimsy explanation here, to where, again, it's meant to explain his disappearance at the time of AC3, when all it does is just add more slop to the connection between games. But with that, we then get to the final modern day segment of the game, where we see the numbskull being tasked to upload Shay's story to some very specific people, taking us to the server room, where we do actually get access to an area not available in AC4. So that's something. But this is where we get the reveal that we did all this so that Otto Burr can send this footage to the assassins to taunt them, I guess. Where, I mean, in this sequence, we do actually get some pretty cool messages, seeing the assassins in panic, with Gavin Banks ordering the assassins to hide, and we get the confirmation that William Miles is still alive, which again would have been cool at the time, but really all this does not matter. This is so stupid. This is really just showing how superfluous the modern day in this game is. The fact that it's simply just there for the sake of it, where this really just adds nothing to the table, and the characters involved really get nothing out of this. But either way, the game obviously concludes with Incomplete Memory 3, where Shay and Franklin arrive at the Palace of Versailles, which obviously doesn't look nearly as impressive as it does in AC Unity, really highlighting the leap in graphics between the two entries. But here we do sneak through the palace, with him using social stealth at points, which would have been cool if he were an assassin. As we do near our target, we pass by two little kids introducing each other, named Arno and Elise, which I wonder if that will matter. But obviously, if you've started AC Unity or even know what that game's initial premise is, you would start to piece together what is happening here, as in our final bit of gameplay, we do assassinate Charles Dorian, Arno's dad, with this game explaining why he was murdered because he had the precursor box. Also meaning that took Shay 16 years to find the box, but again, all this obviously being this lead into Unity, connecting itself to the very beginning of Unity, except it doesn't really. To where I see a lot of people really applaud this ending, thinking this is a really cool way of connecting the two games, but again, I just see it as another example of why this game is the complete mess that it is, with this being such a blatant retcon. Now you will question, how can this be a retcon when AC Rogue and Unity came out on the same day? The answer is because AC Unity was written way before Rogue was. Again, Rogue was developed over the course of a singular year, while Unity was developed for 4 years. To where with writing being one of the first aspects of a game to be finalized, that means Unity was written way before Rogue. To where, while on the surface level, this can be looked at as this cool connective tissue between games, this scene was entirely written after the fact, which is why it plays no factor into Unity. That is why Shay doesn't appear in Unity, and why Arno has no aspirations of finding his father's killer, because his father's killer wasn't defined yet, which leads to some ridiculousness in that game, which we'll talk about. But also there's even some ridiculousness in this game, where we do get this final conversation between Charles and Shay, which is also really dumb, as it makes no sense within the canon, with Charles saying here that Connor and his assassins in the American Revolution undid your Templar business. Once again, this is 1776. This is mid-AC3, again, right after the Thomas Hickey assassination. This makes no sense. Again, Connor hasn't even made that much of an impact on the Americas at this point. Well, also Achilles is still Mentor at this point. Why are you not mentioning Achilles and his assassins? Also, what are the other assassins? There's barely any other assassins at this point. And it's also really dumb to see Shay say in his final words that perhaps we'll start a revolution of our own, implying the French Revolution, which again would have been cool if Shay had anything to do with the start of the French Revolution. Which again makes his exclusion from Unity even more ridiculous, where this seemingly implies that he is involved when he isn't. I mean, all this is so stupid, and the game ends with Shay walking away as we get this final monologue from him. A funny trope of this game and Unity, where they literally just end their games with the characters telling you their development through the game instead of just showing it. Which, I mean, to be fair, they were initially going to do that in AC3, and I would have loved that if that was the case in AC3, where I still think Connor's speech is one of my favorite speeches in all of AC, but Shay's here is just weird in him talking about how he has a new creed, essentially declaring a templarized version of the creed, which is funny as we never see Shay actually care about these ideals. Again, throughout the entire game, we never see Shay once mention the notion of him caring about anything that the Templars actually believe in. He talks about freedom more than he talks about order, which to be fair is a very rudimentary outlook on the creed in itself, but his overall actual beliefs do feel very much more in line with the Assassins than it does with the Templars, which makes it even more ridiculous that he sticks with the Templars beyond this. He supposedly never turns on the Templars and becomes this major figure within the Templar Order, which is dumb, considering he doesn't actually seem to believe in their cause until this point where he just randomly does. Though again, obviously the speech does mirror his initial speech and him saying that he is Shay Patrick Cormac, Templar of the Colonial of the American Right, which again, I always found that funny. They even bothered to have him correct himself there. And also, is he of the American right when he supposedly hasn't been to America in forever because he's searching for the box? So again, all of this just a ridiculous ending to this game. I think this is actually just a joke of an ending to where while people will praise this for connecting itself to Unity, it really doesn't. It's really just a complete mess that very much feels like a thing written at the last second with no real thought put into it, no real fact checking, which again is the issue with how Ubisoft handled Assassin's Creed at this point, probably still handles it, to where there's too many cooks in the kitchen. It feels like there's no one really keeping the lore of this franchise intact, to where there's just so many inconsistencies throughout the end portion of this game, to where again, while on paper, again, you can look at it as a success. Again, I do think if I did not care about the lore of Assassin's Creed, again, this is fine as an outcome, but when you do look at the lore of Assassin's Creed, it's just a complete disaster. But again, the game doesn't end there just yet, as we do actually get a post-credit scene in this game, back in the modern day, where we see Melanie, Violet, and Otto Berg celebrating with Numbskull in Melanie's office, and proceed to give him a choice to join the Templars, all while being threatened to be killed if he doesn't, which is so dumb. A final scene here that's just so useless, again, it being just such a non-choice, and also, again, ends up showing the Templars negatively here, or them spending the entire game trying to show them positively, only for them to just not at the end. But also, we just never get the resolution to this anyway. And again, who cares, because it's based around a character no one gives a shit about. I legitimately just find this very laughable they even bother to wrap up the modern day here at all, as well as does play into all this propaganda from Otto Berg about how people are going to turn on the assassins to join the Templars. It really just does not lead to anything. And with that, that is the end of Assassin's Creed Rogue, which again, obviously you can't tell through my retrospective, I have very mixed opinions about, a lot of negative. Where again, while this game does have a unique concept of you playing as a Templar, it really ends up botching that concept in favor of making the most shallow and generic Assassin's Creed experience, again feeling very derivative of recent AC games from a gameplay front, and just being a mess from a storytelling perspective, feeling like a massive retcon that doesn't gel well with the rest of the entries in the series. So again, Rogue is a largely lackluster Assassin's Creed game, one that I have declared as one of the worst in the franchise. Though, despite that, I do actually enjoy playing the game, and I do find this game pretty memorable to me, to where I've played this game numerous times. It's a game that I can play and get a laugh out of, though it's never a game that I would say is an actual good Assassin's Creed game in particular. Though, again, I would be lying if I say I get nothing out of this game. Though, again, that doesn't change the fact that it's a pretty underwhelming entry in the series that had potential from a conceptual standpoint, but never actually lives up to that. And with that, again, those are my thoughts on Assassin's Creed Rogue. Now, again, I will be doing a retrospective for AC Unity as well, so stay tuned for that. Beyond that, again, I still intend on continuing with these Assassin's Creed retrospectives yearly. Obviously, I'll talk about Syndicate next year. And in general, again, I'll still do other retrospectives at points, straight up, probably less often than what I used to, but still for major games that I actually care enough to talk extensively about, like I do with AC Rogue, I guess. So with that, again, those are my thoughts on Assassin's Creed Rogue. Thank you for watching.